The fall can be a challenging time to target bass. However, if you could stay in front of the bass while they're transitioning throughout the fall, you can have some of the best days out in the water and you can catch some huge bass. In this video, I will be explaining the lures that I use to catch bass in the early fall, the mid-fall, and the late fall. I have picked 3 lures to talk about for each of the 3 sections that will work in many conditions across the whole country. If you enjoy this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We are on the way to 5K by the end of the year, and I really do appreciate the support that the channel has been receiving recently. It really does mean so much to me. Currently, at the time of recording this, the channel is at 2,960 subs, and I really can't believe how close we are to 3K. I still can't wrap my head around it. During the early fall, bass will start coming out of their summer patterns and start following bait fish up into shallow water. This is because during the early fall, the fall transition occurs. To sum up the fall turnover, the cooler water that is in the lower layer of the lake during the summer switches with the warmer water that is in the upper layer. This makes it to where the warmer water is now in the lower layer of the lake, while the cooler water is now in the upper layer of the lake. During the early fall, one of the best ways to target bass is by staying shallow. I normally like to go into the back of creek arms or in the back of pockets this time of year. It really just depends on where the bass are at. 90% of the time, I will target wood cover and docks this time of year. The first lure that I like to use during the early fall is the Texas rig. The Texas rig is perfect this time of year, especially if you're targeting areas where other lures will get snagged at. By Texposing the hook, you can throw the Texas rig pretty much anywhere and it will not get snagged, even if you are fishing around heavy cover. Due to how much I target wood cover and docks, this is one of the best lures that you can have tied on this time of year, especially with how many different forages you can imitate just by changing up the soft plastic and what size weight you use. Generally though, I like to use a beaver style bait or a crawl this time of year, depending on what the bass are feeding on. Don't be afraid to get your Texas rig as close to the cover that you are targeting, and I would also recommend to use a bobber stopper to hold your weight in place. Depending on how deep of water you are fishing will determine what size weight that you should use. However, it is best to use as light of a weight as possible so it looks natural whenever it's falling through the water column. Whenever the bass are holding tight to cover, one of the best lures that you can pick up is the Texas rig. The second lure that I use whenever I'm fishing during the early fall is the Wacky Rig. The Wacky Rig is a great choice during the early fall due to how it falls throughout the water column. Depending on what soft plastic you use will determine how quickly that your Wacky Rig will fall through the water column. If you want the Wacky Rig to sink more slowly, I would recommend a Yum Dinger. But if you want it to sink more quickly, I would recommend a Yamamoto Senko. Personally, I like to use the Yamamoto Senko whenever I'm fishing the Wacky Rig, but it really does come down to personal preference and what the bass are wanting to feed on for that day. It is also important to use O-rings whenever you're fishing the Wacky Rig because you will not go through as many soft plastics compared to if you were not using an O-ring. During the early fall, I like to skip the Wacky Rig up under docks, around grass lines, and up under branches that are hanging over the bank. I was just recently on Lake Gunnersville using the Wacky Rig targeting docks and weed lines, and I had a great day out on the water targeting these areas. The Wacky Rig truly does shine in the early fall because of how well it works in shallow water situations. The Wacky Rig is an important lure to have tied on during the early fall, and it will get bit when nothing else will. The third lure that I use whenever I'm fishing during the early fall is the Underspin. The Underspin is a great choice whenever you are targeting bass that are feeding up on bait fish this time of year. The Underspin stands out compared to all the other bait fish because of the blade under the jig head and can draw some aggressive strikes out of the bass this time of year. The Underspin does really well whenever you're imitating shad or blueback herring, depending on where you're fishing at in the country. However, it is important to imitate whatever the bass are feeding on in the body of water that you are fishing. You can also change what size bait fish you are imitating just by changing up the size of the soft plastic on the back of the jig head. Personally, I like to use a Kitech Fat Swing Impact, but it really does come down to personal preference and what you like to use. By selecting the right size soft plastic to use, you can better imitate imitate what the bass are feeding on during the early fall, but generally, I like to go with a smaller size paddle tail due to how small the bait fish are this time of year. Generally, during the early fall, the bass will be up shallow while also being suspended higher up in the water column. This is the perfect time to pick up the underspin and can result in some huge bites during the early fall. Mid-fall is personally my favorite time to fish out of the whole entire fall due to how aggressively the bass are feeding up on bait fish. Mid-fall is probably one of the best times of the whole entire year that you can throw reaction style lures. It is crucial for you to be able to locate the bait fish on the body of water that you are fishing during the mid-fall. You can achieve this by using your fish finder or just watching the bass blow up on bait fish. However, a good rule of thumb is to stay shallow near cover that the bass and bait fish can relate to. This time of year, I mainly like to focus on docks, wood cover, and rocks, depending on where the bait fish are relating to for that day. Do not be afraid to venture out into deeper water, especially if you see bait fish relating to deeper water, or if you see bass blowing up in the middle of the lake. The first lure that I use whenever I'm fishing during the mid-fall is the whopper plopper. The whopper plopper is a great choice this time of year, especially whenever the bass are blowing up on bait fish. You can have some of the best topwater eats of the whole entire year during the mid-fall, and is a very addictive way to catch big bass. I mainly imitate shad, blueback herring, or bluegill, depending on where I'm fishing at and what the bass are feeding on. I will throw the whopper plopper pretty much anywhere that I think the bass are this time of year. The sound that the whopper plopper makes can draw a bass in from really far away, especially in clear water conditions, and is an effective way to target bass that are in the top of the water column. If you want to change up the sound of the whopper plopper, you can experiment with the different sizes to see what the bass will be more willing to eat for that day. Sometimes the whopper plopper can be overfished on certain bodies of water, and this is whenever I will pick up the Berkeley Chopo. The Berkeley Chopo has a completely different sound compared to the whopper plopper and can be a good way to catch bass that are conditioned to hitting the whopper plopper. Make sure whenever you are out on the water that you experiment to see what the bass are more willing to hit. You can never go wrong with throwing a topwater plopper this time of year. The second lure that I like to use whenever I'm fishing during the mid-fall is the spinnerbait. The spinnerbait is a great choice this time of year, especially if you are targeting suspended bass. The spinnerbait also works well up shallow and can draw out some huge bass that are relating to cover. I love to roll the spinnerbait over wood or bump it into docks to trigger some huge reaction strikes. The spinnerbait does well imitating many different types of bait fish, but personally I like to imitate shad or blueback herring this time of year. Here in the Carolinas, we have an abundance of blueback herring and shad in our lakes that the bass go crazy for this time of year. However, it really depends on where you're fishing at in the country will determine exactly what you should imitate whenever you are throwing a spinnerbait. For example, let's say the main forage in the body of water that you are fishing is perch. You should probably imitate a perch whenever you are fishing the spinnerbait. My personal favorite spinnerbait to use is the War Eagle with a Kitech Fat Swing Impact trailer. However, it really does come down to personal preference to which spinnerbait that you will like, because there's many different options that you can choose from and it can be very overwhelming. Whenever there's a lot of wind and overcast, one of the first lures that I will pick up during the mid-fall is the spinnerbait. The third lure that I like to use during the mid-fall is the crankbait. During the mid-fall, the bass are keyed in on bait fish and they are feeding heavily to get ready for the winter that is just right around the corner. The crankbait truly shines with how many different types of forages that you can imitate and with how deep that you can fish your crankbait. Whenever I am fishing a crankbait during the fall, I normally like to match the hatch with wherever I'm fishing, but generally I like to imitate a shad, a blueback herring, or a bluegill. However, it really depends on what the bass are feeding on where you're fishing at. The bass will be pushing bait fish into the backs of pockets. However, don't be afraid to fish deeper if you see bait fish in deeper water. This is whenever the crankbait truly does shine, because you can use a square bill to target the shallow bass and you can use a deep diving crankbait to target the deeper bass. However, this really depends on where the bass are staging up at on the body of water that you are fishing, but this will be a good way for you to narrow down where you should target them at. The crankbait is one of my favorite lures to use and has caught me several big bass. Personally, I consider late fall whenever the water temperatures start to hit in that 50-degree range, but it really depends on where you're fishing at in the country. During this time, the bass will be feeding heavy, trying to get ready for the winter that is just right around the corner, and you will catch some good quality bass this time of year. It is still very important to locate the bait fish on the body of water that you are fishing. Late fall can be a productive time, especially if you're fishing up shallow, but do not be afraid to target deeper bass that you locate on your fish finder. It is very important to be flexible this time of year, depending on what the bass are feeding on and where the bass are located at on the body of water that you are fishing. The first lure that I like to use during the late fall is the jerkbait. The jerkbait truly shines this time of year, especially with the cooler water temperatures and with how heavy the bass are feeding on bait fish. Whenever it comes down to selecting what color to use when you're fishing a jerkbait, it is important to consider what the bass are feeding on in the body of water that you are fishing. I mainly throw colors like shad, blueback herring, or other bait fish that the bass are feeding on during the fall. The jerkbait is a great lure to use, especially whenever the bass are targeting suspended bait fish. Whenever choosing a jerkbait, I always like to reach for the Megabass Vision 110 due to its lifelike action whenever you're working it throughout the water. Compared to other jerkbaits, in my opinion, the Megabass Vision 110 has the best action on the market and can dive down to 6 feet. The Megabass Vision 110 has caught me many nice bass over the years and is an important lure to have tied on during the cooler months. Megabass makes deeper diving jerkbaits and can be an important tool, especially whenever the bass are suspended in deeper water that you would not be able to normally lure out with a traditional Megabass Vision 110. The Megabass Vision Plus 1 can dive to 9 feet, while the Megabass Vision Plus 2 can dive 12 to 16 feet. You can never go wrong with having a jerkbait tied on during the late fall, and you will catch some huge bass using the jerkbait. The second lure that I use whenever I'm fishing the late fall is the jig. The jig can be an effective lure to use whenever you are targeting deeper bass, and the jig catches some huge bass. The football jig is my favorite lure to use during the late fall by slowly working it across the bottom. During this time of year, I like to fish the jig along creek channels, trying to target some bigger bass. However, the jig will work in many different situations around many different types of cover, and it is important to just locate where the bass are at that day. I normally like to fish a heavier jig this time of year so I can maintain bottom contact so I can get more bites. Whenever I am fishing a jig, I normally like to imitate a bluegill or a crawl, but it really depends on where I'm fishing at. For example, if you're fishing in really muddy water, a black and blue jig would be a very good color to use. Whenever I am fishing a jig this time of year, I like to fish it as slow as possible so I can stay in the strike zone for even longer. Fishing the jig slowly this time of year can trigger even the most lethargic bass to bite, especially during the late fall. I am currently working on a video that goes more in depth on jig fishing during the fall, so if that interests you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. The third lure that I use whenever I'm fishing the late fall is the Ned Rig. Whenever the bite gets tough during the late fall, whenever the water temperatures start to drop, the Ned Rig can be the most effective lure to target even the most lethargic bass. The Ned Rig is one of the best finesse techniques that you can use and works well in many different types of situations. The Ned Rig can resemble many different types of forages that the bass feed on and looks very natural when you are fishing it. Whenever I'm fishing the Ned Rig during the fall, I normally like to imitate shad, blueback herring, or bluegill, but it really depends on what the bass are feeding on in the body of water that I am fishing. Many people think that the Ned Rig only catches small fish, but I am here to tell you that the Ned Rig can catch some huge bass. My personal best smallmouth was caught during the late fall whenever I was fishing the Ned Rig, and I have caught countless other big fish whenever I have fished the Ned Rig. The Ned Rig is the perfect lure to use whenever the bass do not want to bite anything else due to its action whenever you're working working it across the bottom. I like to use the Z-Man Finesse TRD whenever I'm fishing the Ned Rig most of the time, due to the buoyancy in the water. The buoyancy makes the Ned Rig look very realistic, especially whenever you are working it across the bottom, because of how it stands up and looks natural compared to other types of soft plastics. Whenever the bass are not wanting to bite anything else, make sure that you have the Ned Rig tied on. These lures should be a very good starting point whenever you're fishing during the fall, and I plan on doing a more in-depth video talking about where the bass go during the fall. So if that interests you, make sure you comment down below and you subscribe so you don't miss out. It was hard to select just these 9 lures, but these lures will work in many different conditions across the whole entire country. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. Also, let me know if you agree or disagree with my lure choices for the fall. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button so more people can get recommended this video. If you are not subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button, especially if you made it this far in the video. Make sure that you check out this video right here if you are interested in learning more about fall fishing.